It wasn't a scream that haunted Lucas. It was the silence. One moment, Elena was laughing, her voice carrying over the rushing water of the creek, telling him to hurry up and see the view. He stopped to tie his boot maybe 30 seconds, maybe 40. When he looked up, the trail ahead was empty. The birds were still singing. The wind was still rustling the hemlocks, but the laughter was gone. He walked to the bend, expecting to see her smiling, waiting to scare him. But there was nothing but endless, ancient woods and a single, pale blue ribbon tied to a branch, fluttering in a breeze that suddenly felt freezing cold. That was the moment Lucas's life ended, and the waiting began. The Great Smoky Mountains have a way of holding on to secrets. Locals say that the smoke, that thick, blue haze that clings to the peaks, isn't just water vapor. They say it's the breath of the mountain, a living thing that watches those who enter its domain. For Lucas and Elena, the mountains were supposed to be a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the city and recommit. They had been married for 5 years. 5 years of building a life, of shared coffees in the morning and quiet walks in the evening. They were the kind of couple that didn't need to speak to understand each other. A look was enough. To celebrate their anniversary, they rented a small, secluded cabin near tucked away from the tourist traps, deep in the embrace of the heavy timber. The drive up was perfect. The October leaves were burning with color-deep crimsons, burnt oranges, and brilliant golds painting the hillsides. Elena had her window down, her hand riding the wind, her dark hair whipping around her face. She looked radiant, alive in a way that city life often dampened. She turned to Lucas, her eyes bright, and told him she had a feeling this was going to be the best trip of their lives. They arrived at the trailhead early the next morning. It wasn't a difficult hike, just a few miles winding up toward a rocky outcrop that promised a panoramic view of the valley floor. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. Lucas checked his packwater, snacks, a map, a first aid kit. He was always the cautious one, the planner. Elena was the spirit, the one who stopped to look at moss patterns or listen to a distant woodpecker. They started walking, hand in hand, where the path was wide enough. The forest felt welcoming at first. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in cathedral beams, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. They talked about the future, about buying a house with a bigger yard, maybe getting a dog, maybe even starting a family soon. It was the kind of conversation that feels safe, anchored in a certainty that tomorrow will come. Around noon, they stopped for lunch by a small, bubbling stream. The water was crystal clear, cold enough to numb your fingers in seconds. Elena took a picture of Lucas, sitting on a mossy log, biting into a sandwich. He laughed, shielding his face, telling her to stop. She just smiled, that soft, knowing smile, and told him she wanted to remember everything. Every single moment, she had said, as they packed up to continue. The atmosphere began to shift. The sunlight, which had been bright and direct, began to soften as high clouds drifted in. The temperature dropped a few degrees. It wasn't ominous, not yet. It was just the mountains breathing, the weather turning as it often does at higher elevations. Elena spotted a narrow deer trail, branching off the main path. She pointed upward, claiming she could see a better vantage point just 100 yards up through the rhododendron. Lucas hesitated. He liked sticking to the marked trail, but Elena pleaded with her eyes, that playful spark urging him to be a little adventurous. "Just for a minute," she promised. "I want to see the sky." Lucas relented. He told her to go ahead, that he needed to adjust his bootlaces, which had been digging into his ankle. "I'll be right behind you," he said. Those words would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. "I'll be right behind you," a promise he intended to keep, a promise that the mountain would not let him fulfill. Elena turned and scrambled up the narrow path, her blue jacket bright against the dark green of the thicket. He watched her for a moment, admiring her energy, before bending down to retie his left boot. He took his time, wanting to get the fit just right. He heard the crunch of her boots on dry leaves. He heard her hum a little tune. Then the wind picked up. It wasn't a gradual increase. It was a sudden gust that rushed through the ravine, shaking the treetops with a sound like rushing water. The air temperature plummeted. In the span of 60 seconds, a heavy, dense fog began to roll down from the ridge above. It moved unnaturally fast, like a gray curtain being pulled across a stage. Lucas stood up, alarmed by the sudden change. The visibility dropped from miles to 50 feet, then to 20. Elena, a cadet, out expecting her to be just ahead. There was no answer. He figured the wind was carrying his voice away. He started up the deer trail, walking briskly. Elena, it's getting soupy. We should head back to the main trail. He walked for a minute. Then, too, the trail he was following seemed to evaporate, dissolving into a tangle of laurel and briars. He stopped, confused. He had seen her go this way, Espunaron trying to orient himself. But the fog was it was a whiteout, thick and wet, muffling sound. Elena! He shouted louder, cupping his hands. Silence. Not the silence of an empty room, but the heavy, oppressive silence of a forest that is holding its breath. He pushed forward, scratching his face on branches, panic starting to prickle at the back of his neck. She should have been right here. It had only been a minute. He found a footprint in the soft Muda small boot print, unmistakably hers. He felt a surge of relief. "Elena! I see your tracks!" he yelled. He followed the prints for 10 yards. Then they stopped. They didn't fade out. They just stopped, right in the middle of a small clearing, as if she had been lifted straight into the sky. Lucas stood in that small clearing, the gray mist swirling around him like ghosts. He spun in a circle, screaming her name until his throat was raw. "Elena! Elena! Elena!" The only response was the creaking of an old oak tree nearby. A deep, primal fear took hold of him, the realization that he was entirely alone. The logic of the situation battled with the horror. She couldn't have gone far. She must have stepped off the path to pee, or maybe she twisted her ankle and fell into a ditch where he couldn't see her. Lucas began to run, tearing through the undergrowth, no longer caring about the trail. He zigzagged across the slope, calling her name every 3 seconds. Time began to warp. What felt like 10 minutes was actually an hour. The fog grew darker as the afternoon wore on. The temperature continued to drop, biting through his flannel shirt. He pulled out his phone no signal. He knew there wouldn't be, but the no-service text felt like a death sentence. As twilight approached, the woods transformed. The trees looked like twisted figures in the gloom. Shadows stretched and merged. Lucas's panic turned into a frantic, adrenaline-fueled desperation. He tripped over a root, slamming his knee into a rock, but he scrambled up instantly, ignoring the pain. He couldn't stop. Stopping meant admitting she was lost. Night fell with a suffocating weight. The darkness in the Smoky Mountains is absolute. Without the moon, you can't see your hand in front of your face. Lucas turned on his phone's flashlight, the weak beam cutting a narrow cone in the blackness. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like footsteps. "Elena," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Please, baby, just answer me." He spent that first night sitting against the base of a massive tulip poplar, shivering uncontrollably, blowing a safety whistle he found in his pack every 5 minutes. Tweet, tweet, tweet. The sound was piercing, unnatural. He imagined her out there, cold, scared, waiting for him. The guilt was a physical weight on his chest, heavier than the cold. By dawn, the search and rescue teams had arrived. The alarm had been raised when Lucas stumbled back to the trailhead at first light, half frozen and delirious. The scene became a hive of activity. Men in orange vests, tracking dogs, the sound of squawking radios replaced the silence of the woods. Lucas wanted to go back out, but the sheriff made him sit by the ambulance, wrapping him in a shock blanket. He watched the dogs work. Bloodhounds, Noses to the ground, they picked up her scent at the main trail, followed it up the deer path, and then ... nothing. The handlers looked confused. The dogs circled the clearing where the footprints ended, whining, tails tucked between their legs. They refused to go further into the brush. It was as if the scent had been erased. Days turned into a week. The operation was massive. Hundreds of volunteers combed the mountainside. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over the canopy, looking for a heat signature. Lucas didn't sleep. He drank coffee until his hands shook, staring at the topographic maps spread out on the command center hood. He replayed that moment 1,000 times. "I'll be right behind you." On the 10th day, the sheriff pulled Lucas aside. He took off his hat, his eyes filled with a tired pity that Lucas hated. "We're scaling back, son," the sheriff said softly. "We've covered 20 square miles. There's no sign, no clothing, no equipment, nothing." Lucas didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just nodded, looking past the sheriff toward the mist-shrouded peaks. He knew they were wrong. She wasn't gone. She was waiting. Lucas didn't go back to the city. He couldn't. How could he return to the apartment they shared, to the life that was built for two? He rented a small, run-down cabin just outside the park boundaries. He found a job doing handyman work in town, just enough to pay for rent and gas. His real job was the weekends. Every Saturday and Sunday, rain or shine, Lucas put on his pack and went back to the trail. He became a ghost of the forest, a familiar, tragic figure to the park rangers. They stopped trying to talk him out of it. They saw the hollow look in his eyes, the singular focus that kept him putting one foot in front of the other. He wasn't just hiking. He was hunting for a trace. He gritted the woods, moving off-trail, fighting through rhododendron hells that ripped his clothes. He looked for anything: a button, a shred of blue fabric, a wrapper. He talked to her while he walked. He told her about his week, about the leaking roof he fixed, about how much he missed her cooking. Seasons changed. Winter turned the mountains into a skeleton of gray and white. Spring brought an explosion of wildflowers, trilliums and violets, carpeting the forest floor. Lucas hated the beauty of it. It felt cruel that the world could be so beautiful when his world had been destroyed. He stopped shaving, he lost weight. The locals in the diner whispered when he came in for coffee. "That's the husband," they'd say. The one who waits. 1 year passed. Then 2. The police case went cold. Lost in the wild, they wrote in the file. A tragic accident. Maybe a bear. Maybe a fall into a ravine that was inaccessible. But Lucas knew Elena. She was smart. She was tough. The uncertainty was a torture that never ended. It was a wound that refused to scab over. On the 3rd anniversary of her disappearance, Lucas was sitting on the porch of his cabin. It was late, and a storm was rolling in. Thunder rumbled like distant artillery. He held her phone in his hand. He kept it charged, kept the bill paid, just in case. It sat on the table, a black mirror reflecting the lightning. He fell asleep in the chair, exhausted. He dreamed of her. In the dream, she was standing in the clearing, the fog swirling around her knees. She wasn't scared. She looked peaceful. She pointed toward the north, toward a ridge known as the Devil's Spine, a treacherous, rocky razorback that was miles away from where she vanished. She didn't speak, just pointed, her eyes pleading. Lucas woke up with a gasp. The rain soaking his shirt. The dream had been vivid, visceral. He couldn't shake the image of her pointing north. The Devil's Spine was dangerous, strictly off-limits for casual hikers. The search teams hadn't looked. There it was, too far. Physically impossible for her to have reached it in the time window. But logic had failed him for 3 years. At first light, Lucas drove to the nearest access point. The hike to the spine was brutal, a vertical ascent over loose shale and slick roots. His legs burned, his lungs heaved, but he felt a strange pull, a magnetic force dragging him upward. He reached the ridge around noon. The wind here was ferocious, howling across the jagged rocks. He walked the spine, his eyes scanning every crevice. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew he had to be there. He scrambled down a steep scree slope on the north face, sliding uncontrollably until he grabbed a gnarled pine root to stop his fall. And there, he saw it, wedged deep into a fissure in the rock, almost invisible, beneath 3 years of fallen leaves and debris, was something blue. Lucas's heart hammered against his ribs. He crawled toward it, his breath catching in his throat. He reached out with a trembling hand and pulled. It was a backpack, backpack. The blue canvas was faded and stiff with grime, but he recognized the patch he had sewn on it, a small sunflower. He collapsed to his knees, clutching the bag to his chest, a guttural sob tearing from his throat. It was the first time he had truly cried in years. He opened the bag with shaking fingers. Inside, preserved in plastic bags, were her snacks, her water bottle, and a small leather-bound journal she always carried to write poetry. He opened the journal. The pages were damp but legible. The last entry was dated the day she disappeared. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. The fog came so fast, I lost the trail. I tried to go down, but I got turned around. I heard something following me, not on animal. It sounded like footsteps matching mine. I ran until I couldn't breathe. I'm up! High now! I can see the lights of a town, but they look so far away. If you find this, Lucas, know that I wasn't scared at the end. I was thinking of our anniversary. I was thinking of you. I love you. There were no remains, just the bag, tucked away as if she had left it there on purpose. A message in a bottle cast into the sea of trees. The authorities later theorized she had succumbed to hypothermia and the elements had claimed her body, scattering it into the deep wilderness where man is not meant to go. Lucas didn't leave the mountains, but the frantic searching stopped. He had her words. He had the closure of knowing she hadn't simply evaporated. She had fought, she had loved him, until the darkness took her. The video ends with Lucas returning to the spot where the trail ended. 5 years later, he is older now, gray in his beard, his eyes softer. He doesn't bring a search party. He brings a single sunflower. He places it on the rock in the clearing. The fog is there, as always, hanging low in the trees, but it doesn't feel menacing anymore. It feels like a blanket. I found you, he whispers to the wind. I'm still right behind you, Elena. I'm just taking a little longer to catch up. The camera pans up from the sunflower, rising through the canopy, up into the vast, rolling blue expanse of the Great Smoky Mountains. The mist swirls, and for a brief second, the shape of the clouds looks like two people holding hands before dissolving into the ether. The screen fades to black. Narrator. The mountains keep their secrets, burying them under roots and stone. But love, ... Love is the one thing the wilderness cannot swallow. It remains echoing in the valleys, waiting for the day the fog finally lifts.